development, where we are now. And so I want to do a quick introduction, and then we're going to really try to turn it over to our special guest. So I just wanted to make a couple quick statements. We're at war. We're at war for who we are as a city, who's going to be a part of the city, and how we're going to play in this city, how we're going to live in this city, whether our children will live and play in this city. And so today we've invited one of those warriors who've been battling this battle for us. And we're going to all try to tie all of that together into the city's comprehensive plan and what's happening in our city. So before I bring them on, because once I bring them on, I'm going to turn them loose and just try to keep the train on the track. This is my only job, right? But I wanted to do a couple things before I did that. So first of all, I wanted to emphasize again, this is a battle, we're at war, and a couple definitions I wanted to share. So I'm going to see if I can get away with sharing my screen. And let's see. All right, so I hope everyone can see my screen. So before we get started, I wanted to kind of set the tone. So I'm going to use the our CFO's definition of gentrification, because I know that'll come up. The large influx of financial capital moving into certain neighborhoods of the city for commercial and residential development, primarily to better accommodate wealthier in-migrants. So that just means focus on people who don't live here over people who live here. Recently, the council, the OP, the Office of Planning, had submitted their updates to the city's comprehensive plan. And so from OP's perspective, the letter says the role of the comprehensive plan is to help guide that change towards a positive future, both for today's residents and for our children and grandchildren. So you notice it didn't say anything about immigrants, right? The comprehensive plan establishes a context and sets broad goals to inform public decision-making and fine-grained planning efforts. It informs zoning regulations, capital budgeting. However, it does not have the force of law or regulation. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. In its current form, the comprehensive plan reflects the context, aspirations, and trends of the late 90s and early 2000s. Consequently, it does not effectively address current changes of housing, equity, reliance, public resources, nor change we expect in the future. Thus, the urgent need to approve this update. So this is the letter from the Office of Planning on behalf of the mayor to the council to quickly update the comprehensive plan. And then the last thing, the mayor did a housing equity report. And so in that report, she kind of laid out the goals of her administration moving forward. To ensure we achieve our goals, in May, I issued the district's first ever mayor's order on housing, directing the DC government agencies to chart a path toward 36,000 new homes. This report, which provides an analysis of current affordable housing distribution and proposes specific production goals for the future, is the first step towards executing that mayor's order. So that was from that report. And then my final piece, I want to talk about what the comprehensive plan is and a few things that I pulled out from some of the court rulings. So the comprehensive plan is a legislative document enacted by the Council of the District of Columbia. It establishes broad framework intended to guide the future land use planning decisions for the district. The plan is not binding. It contains mandatory and non-mandatory provisions. Provisions are substantial force, even if they are not mandatory. It reflects numerous occasionally completed plans, goals, and expect with substantial provided, specifically provided. And then it also talks about the plan unit development. It's a process that allows the commission, the zoning commission, to grant exceptions to otherwise applicable zoning regulations. So set that out. So without further ado, I want to welcome Ari Teresa, who has been a warrior, who's kind of upset the whole city. Governing infrastructure, and I'm going to allow him to introduce himself, and then we'll get going.
Thanks, William. Thanks a lot. Okay, great. My name is Ari Teresa, and I'm a zoning attorney. My office is located in Anacostia. The name of my firm is Stoop Law, and I'd like to thank Parisa and Empower DC for having me, the Grassroots Planning Coalition. Thank them for having me, and also thank William Jordan, who I've spoken with before and worked with before on many things, and he's very passionate and very intelligent, very knowledgeable about what's going on in the city. I had the pleasure of speaking with him and his brother about development happening in Norfolk, which is very similar to what's going on here, the destruction of public housing and the rearranging of communities. And so it's my honor to be here with him and all of you. So first, I guess where we start, I could give a little background. Between 1995 and 2013, there were 28 zoning appeals. This is from a BizNow article. There are 28 zoning appeals. And none of those zoning appeals were overturned between 1995 and 2013. There were 28 and not a single one was overturned. In 2013, there was Durant v. Zoning Commission. And after that, that case was overturned. It was overturned a couple times. So between 2013 and 2018, according to the BizNow article, there were 57 zoning appeals. Now, I know you guys are familiar with that study, that the report that was done that had a foreword by Sabia Prince with Empower DC that talked about how DC was the most gentrified city in the country between 2006 and 2013. So if you notice that during that time period, DC was pretty much lawless. As far as developers go, it was the Wild West. They were doing whatever they wanted. The courts weren't holding them accountable. There was no cases being overturned. Residents weren't really appealing anything. And during that time period, DC was the most gentrified city in the country. 2013 to 2017, those same people produced another report and said that DC was the 12th most gentrified city in the country. Now, you guys may have seen the article and they said, hey, don't get so excited about that. DC is still being gentrified. And indeed it is. And we'll get to that in a moment. But it is something to think about, that during the time period of 58 appeals, where we were supposedly stopping the construction of affordable housing, and a lot of developments were being held up in court by people who are members of the Grassroots Planning Coalition, residents, pro se members, people I've represented. During that time period, DC dropped from the #1 to the 12th. And according to the study, during the initial study where it was #1, 41% of the census tracts that were eligible for gentrification gentrified in DC, and that was #1. Well, between 2013 and 2017, only 17% of the census tracts eligible for gentrification gentrified in Washington, D.C. So I believe that the work of the Grassroots Planning Coalition, the work of residents opposing some of these irresponsible projects, has actually put a dent in the gentrification of communities and has allowed some communities to stay intact, allowed them to stay together longer. But the challenge now is the response from the city. So, that they weren't just going to let that go down like that. Things had to change. And so,
the Empire Strikes Back.
Right, go ahead. The Empire Strikes Back, exactly. So 6 years ahead of schedule, I believe it. Yeah, 6 years ahead of schedule, they redid the comprehensive plan. And so that's where we're at now. And much of the impetus behind redoing the comprehensive plan was because of all of this pushback that they had been receiving from developers stopping development. I mean, not from developers, but from residents stopping development. And this has impacted not only gentrification, but it's impacted the developers. If you go to the zoning commission's zoning case search tools and you look up the amount of cases that were filed, amount of PUD applications that were filed, and William will talk more about financing later, but if you look at the amount of PUDs that were filed during that time period in 2018, there are only 3. Typically, there are about 10, 15, 20 PUDs filed per year. In 2018, after the courts had created all this uncertainty, overturning cases, considering cases, became a lot harder to get these projects financed. And so there was this incentive from the city and from developers to make it harder to file these appeals. So that's where we're at, and that was the impetus between the for actually changing the comprehensive plan. And when you go through the comprehensive plan, and I'm going to give specific examples, a lot of it changed to make it harder to file these appeals. So I'd say the number one provision that I think.
So Ari, before we go there, no, you go ahead. Let me get my phone.
Okay. Go ahead, William.
All right, I'm back. So what I wanted to do, because I want to make the link before we get into the details. So if going back to your original numbers, so there's I guess the claim overall is that development driven by these developers during the prior to 2013 was an economic boom to the city, and that boom was improving the lives of everyone in this city, whether you were on the top of the pile or the bottom of the pile. The boom was helping everyone, right? And so the argument is that we need to continue that boom that's helping everyone, and that the appeals are the boom that's helping everyone. However, the study said that by nature, gentrification does not help everyone, and that these projects are not helping these communities, it's displacing. So the community, quote unquote, is improving, but the people who would benefit from that improvement are being moved out of those communities.
Correct.
And that the comp plan, which was supposedly designed to ensure the fair, inclusive distribution. In fact, the original comprehensive plan they said is out of date was talked about being for an inclusive city, right? So what we're hearing is that is old-fashioned now. An inclusive city is not something that we want anymore. We need to update because we have new policies.
Right.
And so our guiding document is going to be this comprehensive plan, because that's how we as citizens know what the rules are, basically. What's going to happen in my neighborhood, what's going to happen with my schools, what's going to happen with the amenities that I need for me to plan the future with my children, my grandparents, or however we age in place. So the document kind of gives me a hint of what's going to happen in my community. Now, PUDs allows a developer to make little changes to what's going on. They're not supposed to fundamentally change, but it looks like what occurred during the lawless period is that they use a series of PUDs to fundamentally change the plan without having to change the plan. And the lawsuits basically said, no, you can't do that. You need to do it in the context of the plan.
Right.
Your comments?
Right, and like you brought up when we were speaking the other day, when the court shoots down these cases, they're not ruling on the merit of these projects and whether or not these projects are good projects. They're just basically ruling on the zoning commission's compliance with things like the comprehensive plan, the zoning regulations. And so when they shoot it down, they're basically saying like, look, you guys didn't follow the law. And so, you know, again, the changes behind the comprehensive plan that just transpired was to make it easier for developers to follow the law. And there's a lot at stake here. I wish I could share my screen because I have a lot of great information, but I'm doing this from my phone. I couldn't get my laptop to work. But, you know, between 2010 and 2018, there were 90 PUDs that were proposed. Of those 90 PUDs, 50 of them took place in wards 5 and 6. Now, there are 181 census tracts in Washington, D.C. 20 of those 91 PUDs occurred in 2 census tracts in the Union Market area. And when you look at the data, when you look at the map and you look at the population of people who lived in that area during that time period, what you see is the population grew from this is 10 census tracts surrounding those 2. So the population was about 31,000 people. By 2018, it was 42,000 people. Initially, it was about 20,000 Black people there. By 2018, it lost 3,000 Black people, even though the population grew by 12,000. So it lost about 15% of its Black population. Initially, the white population was 9,000. In 2018, it was 20,000. And so what you see in these areas is that the white population, wherever you see these heavy PUD developments, the white population, particularly, and I'm talking about Union Market particularly now, white population grew by 130%, and the Black population fell by 15%. And so we know that these PUDs disrupt communities. And even when you look at the people who live there, so like I think it was 44% professionals in 2010. By 2018, it was 70% professionals. And so it changes the entire character of the community, these developments. And so, you know, that's what we're dealing with. I want to get a little bit into the comprehensive plan and like what's changed and how it's how it is easier to push these PUDs through and you know, what specifically they did to counter our actions to slow the destruction of our communities. When you look at the land use element 300.1, that basically describes like, it's almost like the, so what's the portion of the comp plan that's gotten approved? What's that called? Is it
the framework? The framework.
So this is the very first provision of the land use element. And basically it's like the framework for the land use element. And it says, describes the balance. This is what it said in the beginning. This is before the change. It says, describes the balance, that this land use element describes the balancing of considerations that must take place for land use change. So basically, they were saying this land use element, the way that the zoning commission is supposed to look at this is they're supposed to look at the different provisions in it and balance them against each other and weigh them and come up with a reasonable reason for why you're balancing, why in your balancing you favor this provision over that provision. And that's what it initially said. And so, you know, all the zoning commission really has to do is balance it and say why they balanced it that way. And if you appeal it in court, then, you know, if they show that they actually balanced it and they actually, you know, weighed the value of each of those considerations, then, you know, whatever they decide, they're going to win, right? They just have to think about it. Well, even with that loose standard, you know, that wasn't good enough for them. So now they've changed it to, you no longer have to balance. You know, this land use element just describes the range of considerations involved. So like, they don't have to balance any of the considerations anymore. They just have to, you know, be aware that, hey, like all of these things are considerations. You don't have to balance them, but just be aware of all of these things.
And one of the things I want you to continue, but what I want to do is try to keep us grounded. So you mentioned Union Market. So let's kind of revolve around that. So where is Union Market?
Okay, Union Market is over there off of Florida Avenue. Yeah, Florida Avenue Northeast.
Right, so it's not far from the 8th Street corridor.
Yeah, it's between the 8th Street corridor and I guess it's over there by Gallaudet.
Right, so it's in between sort of 8th Street and Noma and sort of that.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so there were a series of, actually there were cases filed there as well.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, what was the number of different projects that they were going to do?
Well, they tried to do 20 PUDs in those 2 census tracts that I measured. I don't know how many are in the entire Union Market area, but between 2010 and 2018, they approved 20.
Right. And I think historically that part of Union Market was basically warehouses and
warehouses, light industrial use. It had a lot of blue collar workers there. Yeah.
And then on the edges of it was row house communities.
Yep.
So this is where Black families, working class Black families, were able to buy their first home, raise their kids, go to school.
Yep.
So as well as there were, you know, I guess public housing not too far away, Section 8 housing, but this was a community full of people who were able to matriculate in that area.
Absolutely, yeah, and what you see when you look at the census tract data and you overlay it with where the PUDs are being built, you see that, you know, in the census tracts where the PUDs were actually built in Union Market, even though the population roughly doubled in those census tracts, there's only about a growth of about 50 Black residents there. So like, you know, Black residents grew like slightly. But like when you look around like this census tract where all of these single family homes are, they lose like half of its Black population routinely.
And then the other question was that some of those there were appeals filed because of building height, density. So what are some of the issues that people were raising, and why do you think they were raising some of those issues? They just don't want new shiny buildings? What's
Well,
going
I
on?
mean, I had clients over there, and some of the main concerns was pollution from like actually like disturbing the soil over there. So there'd be like a lot of dust. So like I have clients with health issues over there. When they start digging deep into that like kind of light industrial area, you know, the soil may have had contaminants in it, dust comes out. Um, you know, people were concerned about displacement. People were concerned about, you know, just the changing character of their neighborhoods. Like a lot of these people, like you said, are in 2-story row homes, and they're building like 10-story buildings like right next to them. So people had many issues with that. And you know, as far as the court goes, I'd say probably the most significant finding over in Union Market, in one of the Union Market cases, was that the zoning commission did not have to address gentrification or displacement, which is a shift from Mcmillan. So in the Mcmillan Park case, exactly, thank you, Jim, in the Mcmillan Park case, the court said you have to consider gentrification, right? Well, in another case, about 5 months later, they were like, yeah, they got to consider gentrification because my clients had raised it at the zoning commission. The zoning commission completely ignored them, didn't even address it in their order. And so the way that the court got around this to allow these projects to move forward, and I really want you to talk about the financing piece so people get a good picture of how political some of these court proceedings are. But you know, in order to allow this to move forward, what the court found was that if the comprehensive plan mentions affordability in the small area plan, mentions affordability and mentions displacement, that the zoning commission doesn't have to address it on specific PUD projects. You can just assume that they took their guidance from the small area plan, and whatever PUDs occur within that small area plan, they don't have to consider the objections raised at the hearing, which is a shift. You know, this is a new reading. It's not anything that anybody would know, but it's a new reading. So go ahead.
So to address that, because I want to stay on that just for a little bit, so I'm going to share my screen again, because this will allow us to kind of talk about what we kind of talked about and trying to bring this up. So part of what we try to do is to take a look at the different forces at play in the development of our communities and our neighborhoods, and how that plays out with the comprehensive plan, and the different perspectives that are moving and having a sway on who's are and what it means to live in a community. So one of the things we did is trying to break this thing down into how the courts view things. So that's one of the views. The other view is how neighborhoods and communities in that particular area, how they view what's going on and how they rely on the comprehensive plan. And we acknowledge that within a neighborhood, there may be different communities with different issues and desires. Then we have the mayor and council, sort of the political view of what's going on in the area, how things are developed. And then of course we know about the developers. I skipped down to developers. But one of the places that we don't spend a lot of time talking about is who's financing these projects and why. And so one of the things I wanted to begin to bring into the conversation is where's the money coming from? You can't build a 10-story building and go to industrial bank and get a loan and build a 10-story building that costs $130 million to build. Money is coming, big money is coming from somewhere. And much of that money is coming from pension funds or private equity funds, but pension funds, which are often like Vanguard, where we put our money to save for retirement. Pension funds like teacher pension funds, they have to put money in and make money so that they can pay out people later on when they retire. So in many cases, we're paying for the large projects that come into our backyards through the investments in our pension funds. And then, of course, the last thing is that in today's city, the mayor and council are asking private institutions that are supposed to have a public good to act as developers. So that's your universities and hospitals. So they're usually are often treated specially tax-wise or public service-wise, but they have but now they're being asked, so they have benefits that they get because they serve the public, but now they are in the financial game. So if you could, looking at these areas, can you kind of relate them to what's going on at Union Market in this example? Or grab a few. So let's skip the courts. We kind of talked about community. What do you think the motivation that the mayor and council has in their view of the comp plan or development in that area? What do you see as their perspective?
Okay, right. I wanna answer one of the questions that was posed.
Okay.
And then I can do that. So I want to answer Jim's question about how the projects and that not that many projects have actually been stopped by lawsuits. And I want to say you're absolutely correct. To my knowledge, only one project has been stopped by lawsuit, and I would say that project would be Durant. That's something that just hasn't happened. But almost all of the projects that have been appealed have gone forward, win or lose. So, we know Mcmillan is being held up right now, but, it just seems kind of like, from the outside looking in at this point, even though I was involved in it at various points, that it's just moving closer and closer to becoming developed. And at Berry Farm, even though we won, they still put people off the site. They haven't proposed a new project yet at the zoning commission. And we're not sure what they're going to do there. But, these projects move forward regardless. And so this was all a part of my education as an attorney and realizing that the courts aren't really a place to stop a project. And at most, the most that you can hope for is to extract some sort of equity out of the project. So yeah, I think that's important to note. There's another question. Yes, Andrea Rosen. Yes, one of the cases at Untitled, we appealed. The zoning commission, basically a PUD is only supposed to be approved if it provides some sort of superior benefit. It needs to be a superior benefit. And so a lot of the a lot of the claims that developers make towards having superior benefits are about the affordable housing they provide. And so what used to happen routinely was they would provide the bare minimum inclusionary zoning amount, which is 8%, and say, hey, this is a superior benefit. But we challenged that at court, even though we lost the case on some other reasons that had to do with standing. But, since then, since we brought that up and we made that an issue, they've started offering 10 and 12%. Or instead of doing the bare minimum AMI, they reduce the AMI some to get around that. So they've actually started to grapple a little bit with, the superior benefit provision in the comprehensive plan. So yeah, I would just say that, it's very incremental. Courts aren't going to stop a project. Things may become a little bit better. But as you can see, even by delaying these projects, when you look at the studies, between 2013 and 2017, we've had an impact. I don't know how long it's going to last because, you know, they're changing the laws back into their favor. But, you know, just fighting back has helped people stay in their communities and I think kept DC more affordable than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, well, you know, one of my first experiences with zoning or in the comp plan and particularly projects that were also public-private partnerships with the city, which is, I think, a special case where the city is sort of on both sides of the ledger, right? They have an oversight role as the city, representing the public, but they're also partners in the development deal. So my first experience was the Highland Park over here in Columbia Heights off of 14th Street that was done by Donatelli Development. So I was on the ANC commission at that time. So I went to the zoning hearing and asked them, would they put the agreement, the LDA agreement, into the zoning agreement? Because the developer was supposed to do 20% affordable housing and had made all these community benefit kind of agreements. And so, however, the city, working with the developer, who of course was very tight with several mayors, held the development to the zoning agreement. And the zoning agreement had much lighter community benefits. So they were able to step down the value of the community benefits. And so even though the LDA required 20% affordable housing, the argument of the developer was, because IZ had just come into play, that this is an improvement over IZ. Because instead of 10%, I'm giving you 20%. But the 20% was already required and paid for by the public. So I argued that couldn't be a community benefit. We paid for it. How can the developer get a community benefit if we paid for it? And so the zoning commission said that it could not legally bind the LDA to the zoning agreement. And I found that incredulous that that was possible. What do you mean? They both apply to the same project, but you can't bring them together and enforce it. And they, of course, they refused. And, you know, so ever since then, I've never trusted the system, either the city, DNPED, or the zoning commission to act on behalf of my community.
Right.
Ari, did you freeze up? Okay.
Now I was looking at some of these questions. I see we have like 7 question and answers.
Go for the questions.
Okay, let's see.
Go for however you want it to flow. You know, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you know, you're the star of the show.
What is the difference between binding and mandatory? I don't know. It seems pretty similar to me. Binding. I think mandatory, there's probably less wiggle room than binding, because something can be binding and not dispositive, but mandatory seems like it's pretty dispositive. So I would say that mandatory is more, it has less wiggle room than binding, I think, just looking at it. The other one is, what census tracts are eligible for gentrification? That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't like looked deep into the methodology for that study. All I know is that 17% is better than 41%. But I would have to look into that methodology to determine how they came up with the census tracts that were eligible for determination, but gentrification. But I would imagine that it had something to do with, you know, and they've done this for decades. They've qualified neighborhoods as stable or unstable, and probably has something to do with that. So It's a long one, Anthony. I'm gonna come back to this. Let me see.
I see a question here about Eagle Bank. So I'll go and,
okay, I'll read Tony's while you do that.
Yeah. So I'm gonna show my screen again. So based on, Ari's suggestion, I've decided I was gonna try to figure out how to follow the money at Union Market. And so if you can see my screen here, Union Market started with, there were several developers that all came together in order to get money from the city in the form of a TIF, right? I think it was 85 million or something in that range to pay for infrastructure costs. So the way the deal worked is, at that time, and it's flowed over time, Eaton developer, level 2, JBG, working with Gallaudet University in a group called LDR, came together and they needed money to pull this project off. So to do Union Market, this isn't developers doing it on their own. They got money from the city, and the tune at the time was the largest TIF that the city had ever done. And so to get the TIF, they came together and formed a coalition, the Union Market Coalition, and came to the city and asked for $85 million that flowed into the developers, right? Then most of those same developers on other projects were already getting tax abatements from the city. So nearby projects, so these projects here were projects nearby Union Market that was helping to create the value for the Union Market project, and the similar people were getting money. But where was the money coming from? Well, the money was coming from Vanguard, which does your 401k, BlackRock, which is heavily owned by PNC Bank, Norges Bank, which is really the Norway bank, State Street Funds, which is a big investment bank, and TAA Craft, which deals with public sector employees, right? These same entities also are the majority or the top shareholders in Eagle Bank, right? So when you see a lot of these developments that happen in the city, what you see is these same investors who then are invested in a company like JBG Smith. These are the top shareholders in JBG Smith. So these people here who invest money, usually on our behalf, are also invested in the developers. The developers then come to the city. The city gives the development, the project, money through TIFs, which is basically a free loan, tax abatements, right? So all of these projects, and in these typical projects, the cost of an efficiency is between $1,700 and $2,000. In a 3-bedroom is usually over $4,000 a month. And then the PUD is basically putting money in a project because it's air rights. You're basically selling, in most cases, land and air rights so they can do a bigger project. But the same entities own a piece of every phase of the project, and the city puts in the money, which basically guarantees the profit. So they just have to keep it going. So when you have Vanguard and these large pension funds investing in the project next door to your house, you almost don't stand a chance. And the TIFs, and so when we talk about credit ratings and all those kind of things, this is to make the money cheaper that the city then gives to the developers. And those developers work with the large pension funds. So the question about Eagle Bank, yes. But the question is, who owns Eagle Bank? And it's the same players. And who owns JBG Smith? one of the biggest developers, and JBG Smith was a financier of most of these guys over here. And where do they get their money? From these guys. So when you see the lobbyists working Wilson Building, they're actually working on behalf of these guys here, our 401ks and our pension funds. So I'll stop there and let you pick up the next question.
Okay, so I want to go to Andrea Rosen's question because I started to answer that, but she gave some clarification on it. So basically, the comp plan, you're right, the comp plan is not binding. And so what that means is if you have mandatory provisions that are that are located within a non-binding document, basically what the court said is, and this is in the Mcmillan ruling, if you were to look at that, you can find it on Google Scholar, Friends of Mcmillan Park versus the DC Zoning Commission. But what they say is if there are two mandatory provisions within the non-binding comprehensive plan, the zoning commission just has to look at the two mandatory provisions and say if they're conflicting, if the two mandatory provisions are conflicting, and say why they went with one over the other. Or even if there's a non-mandatory provision that conflicts with the mandatory provision, they would have to weigh why they went with one over the other. So that's the answer to that question. Let's see, there's several others. How do you think map amendments will change the development process and how can residents stay on top of them? Now, that's an interesting question. A lot of the map amendments that are done not in a legal manner. So well, actually, let me take this. There are two ways to do a map amendment. One is a rulemaking and one is a contested case. If you do a map amendment as a contested case, it's just checking for the zoning's consistency with the comprehensive plan. So like however you're trying to zone that map amendment, they're just making sure that it's consistent with the comprehensive plan, which is the non-binding document. So that's pretty easy to do, which differs from the PUD process where you have to weigh benefits and you have to mitigate impacts and all that sort of thing. With a map amendment process, you don't even have to consider what's going to be built. In fact, the zoning commission cannot consider what's going to be built. All they're considering is how they're amending the map and like what zoning designation is going to be there and whether or not it's consistent with the comprehensive plan. And the way that they're doing this illegally, a lot of the times, I've seen this happen at least 4 times in 4 separate cases, is that a map amendment, when they do it as a rulemaking, it doesn't give the residents a chance to oppose it in any significant manner. So if you do it as a rulemaking, basically they're just saying, this is a policy decision we're making. And, we're amending this map, it's a policy decision, and you have as much right to contest this as you have to contest a bill that council's trying to pass, because this is a policy decision. But how they're implementing it is they're like doing map amendments on like 1 or 2 lots that are like 35 square feet or something. That's really small. That's not policy, right? That involves, the person building and the neighbor, and that's a contested case. And so, I would say that, one way to determine whether or not a map amendment is being done as a rulemaking appropriately is to make the determination, is this policy or is this like small? If it's small, if the development's not separated by a street, then probably it should be done as a contested case. But if it, if it includes several blocks, then, or, it's a pretty big site, then, maybe it could be done as an amendment. As a map amendment can be done as a rulemaking. But even map amendments as a contested case are are damaging to community input compared to the PUD process. And the way that you stay on top of it is you just go to the zoning website and you analyze what's in there, and it'll say in there whether it's a PUD or a map amendment. Sometimes it's a PUD with a map amendment, and that's okay. If it's a PUD, you'll be able to contest through the process as a PUD. But if it just says map amendment, make sure to check if it's being done as a rulemaking or contested case. And if it's being done as a rulemaking, make sure that it's actually policy and it's a big project and not something really small, because they're trying to put really small projects through a map amendment that's a rulemaking, and they shouldn't. Now, if it's a contested case map amendment, you really need to get your ANC on board, because they have say on that. Their great weight has a lot of pull on whether or not a map amendment should be done. So that's that. I'm gonna go to some other questions.
So Ari, on that, does the ANC get notice of the other type of text amendment?
Yeah, ANC should always get notice of a map amendment or text amendment.
Right. So if you are on top of your ANC, then they should be providing you as a community member with, when they get a notice, they should be notifying the community. And of course, in a lot of cases, that doesn't happen. Most time, the community member doesn't know, but the responsibility of the ANC is actually, when they get a notice, is to make sure their community is notified.
Right. I don't know the answer to your question, Reggie. It was, has the mayor stopped any projects? Can you read the questions, William, without freezing up? I can't do it on my phone. Can't hear you.
Let's see, where were we? Okay, there's a question here. The NCRC defines neighborhoods eligible to gentrification is those in the lower 40 percentile of income or home value, but not gentrifying. They counted 9,743. I guess that's in the country. The number is for all cities that was in that particular study. So that's not really a question.
Clarification. Thank you for the clarification.
So those are the only questions I see.
You don't see the Q&A. There's like 15 in there.
Okay. Oh, now I see. All right. Let's see. Okay, here's one on Bruce Monroe. Being that the decision for Bruce Monroe has been remanded back to the Zoning Commission, can you help those that don't understand what it means to get some clarification? I guess what it means to be remanded back. And I've been asked this a dozen times, and I would like your help and others to understand. So what does it mean to be remanded back by the Zoning Commission? So what does that really mean for us?
Okay, so when it got remanded back, basically that means that the Court of Appeals looked at the case and they identified several problems with the Zoning Commission's ruling. And so basically the Zoning Commission, they're not going to start the case over again. They're just going to address those issues. And so the parties that were originally involved in the case can now submit testimony, evidence, documents, whatever, addressing the specific issues that were the reason for the case being remanded in the first place. And I think with Park Morton, it's like 7 issues.
Right.
Yeah, and so you have to keep your arguments narrow to those 7 issues. And then the Zoning Commission will consider them and hopefully do it how the courts have outlined for them. And the courts have explained to them why their findings on those 7 issues, their findings or their conclusions on those 7 issues were inadequate. And so the zoning commission now is going to try and approve it, in accordance with what the court has explained.
Right. Now, just for curiosity's sake, say the zoning commission responds back to the court. And so what happens? Can that be appealed again?
The zoning commission responds back to the courts. Yeah, it can be appealed again. That's what happened in Mcmillan Park.
Right, okay. So it's likely that unless they reach some kind of resolution, that will just be in another appeal cycle on that case.
Yeah, I mean, if the residents, if they don't come to some sort of compromise about what should be done at the site, it's likely that it will be held up in another round of appeals.
Okay. Another question from Margaret Dwyer. As part of our work to protect and expand public housing, we want to find a way to challenge the structure of the Housing Authority Board of Commissioners, which now has a voting seat for DNPED, which exerts inordinary sway on the board and is dominated by mayoral appointees. Is there a way that you can see for a challenge to this rubber stamp structure? So I guess it's focused on the Housing Authority.
Yeah, I mean, depending on, I haven't looked at the statute, but every agency has a statute that kind of outlines how it, is organized and how it should function. And if there's an argument to be made, if I know DCHA is an independent agency. And so, there may be even more clear language in the statute. Like I said, I haven't looked at it. But, if there's an argument that can be made that, hey, like DCHA is not an independent agency because it has DNPED on its board and it's exacting an inordinate amount of power, then yeah, like it can be challenged. I believe it can be challenged. Will the court buy it? I don't know, but I think that it can be challenged.
Going back, I think this is focused on Union Market from Grayland Pressberry. Where did or do all the people actually live? In the old farmers market area. I guess this is from Union Market, Ivy City, south of Florida Avenue, east of Gallaudet. So I guess they're asking about your clients or the people who you've been working with.
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't remember their addresses, but I know one of them was like right across the street from. They were a 200-footer. So yeah, I mean they lived right around the site. A lot of the residences around there are single-family homes, low-lying, 2 stories.
Let's see. This is from Lark Cato. Is there anything DC residents can do legally to stop the trolley? I guess that is the streetcar that because I think recently there was a issue at council where they wanted to move me from the capital budget for the streetcar into public housing, repairs, and development. So I guess the question is there a way to challenge that?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. This is from Anonymous. What's the status of stalling the development in Anacostia? Can you discuss more about the rumors of it becoming a new Georgetown, where there be proportionate numbers of public housing units, inclusionary zoning to accommodate the longtime Black residents that have not been displaced yet?
No. What I can say is there are several projects being proposed in Anacostia right now along the same order as Union Market. And I think it's going to have a predictable effect. What do you have? You have the 11th Street Bridge project, you have Poplar Point, you have, which is called Columbia Quarters, you got the Starbucks over there, you got the Gateway, you got the Gateway across the street, you got 4 Points project, which is like 8 buildings. And so what I think is going to happen is a lot of the people renting in historic Anacostia will end up getting displaced. If it follows what happened in Union Market, which I think it will, then yeah, a lot of people get displaced. Now our councilman has done some good work over there and has stood up for us. There was a TIF, which is tax incremental financing, over there at the Reunion Square project to build a hotel and a bunch of market rate housing. And the councilman at least changed the first phase of it. So it's no longer going to be a hotel, it's going to be affordable senior housing. So that's the kind of development that will stop, well, not stop, but at least create some affordability. So when the market rate stuff starts coming, that people do get to stay in the community. Because what I found was wherever there are these PUDs, the areas that tend to do the best in terms of displacement are areas that contain public housing, areas that contain massive amounts of affordable housing. But I would say that Anacostia is in danger. I wouldn't say that it's for certain going to happen, because there's a lot of uncertainty with our economy right now. But I would say that Anacostia is in danger, that they've planned for Anacostia what they have done in Navy Yard and what they have done in Union Market. And there's a concentration of market rate housing and amenities and retails being proposed in a community that really isn't it's not development for the community. It doesn't really fit the people who live here right now. This is fitting the city's mandate to just keep growing its population. And the way that the city looks at certain neighborhoods is that they're a liability, because people use social services, they're not making that much, so it's not that high of a tax base. And so the city's perspective is, look, we're not gonna give you guys amenities over there. We're not gonna invest in placing amenities or invest in different sorts of things over there, because you guys are already a drain. So the only way that that stuff's gonna come is if we can displace you. And so that's like what the TIF is all about. And so the TIF is, I know this was a question in there too. So the TIF is tax incremental financing. And so over there where they're proposing Reunion Square, they're saying basically for the next 20 years, this developer doesn't have to pay property taxes on what they built here. They will pay property. They'll just pay their current tax rate. So right now it's a parking lot. So whatever the tax rate is on a parking lot, they're going to pay that for the next 20 years. The city gets this money back because, when they put a hotel there, after the 20 years is up, it will have, not even after the 20 years is up, but once they put a hotel there, it's going to increase the property values of everything around it. And so they'll be able to tax those property values. And so they're getting money back through the people who live nearby. And they get money back after the 20 years is up, and they can actually tax on the full hotel, because a hotel, they're going to collect a lot more taxes off of a hotel than an empty parking lot. So that's what a TIF is. It's basically a tax abatement for a specific amount of time, locking you into what you're currently paying, even though you may be significantly increasing the tax value of your property. That's a TIF.
Yeah, yeah, and then the developer gets to count that to finance their project.
Exactly, it's debt finance.
So it's a loan that's paid through taxes that they don't pay, but you pay.
Yeah.
So in many communities, when you get a TIF next to you, is you pay through the raised taxes.
Yeah.
And the amount on the loan for that new project that raised your taxes.
Yeah.
And then your question has to be, do you benefit from that project? Well, if that project only doesn't bring jobs, doesn't bring new grocery stores and amenities that you can use, but only brings new luxury housing and amenities that help to support that project, then you're paying for your own destruction. So this is why it's so heinous in terms of what we're experiencing in the city, whether it's a tax abatement, which does the same thing, except that's, at least with a TIF, the developer or the city pays interest. But the tax abatement is free. So when the big developer gets a tax abatement, that's free money for them, that they don't have to go borrow from anywhere to pay for their project. So that's profit.
Right. Could you read the one about the developing west of the park, or building affordable housing in single family neighborhoods?
Okay, let's see. Okay, here it is. From Jim Werner. What do you think about the comp plan revisions to promote the development in wealthier neighborhoods, softening single family zoning, saying should make these areas more available because they have better amenities, schools, and transportation? Is the plan to leave other neighborhoods behind rather than make them well supported too? Are these areas now more attractive to developers? What's the motivation for highlighting them so much in the comp plan?
Okay, well, here's the thing. I think that there are 3 different housing markets in DC. So one is west of the park, where the city's motivation and the residents' motivation primarily is to preserve their property values. It happens those areas are segregated, mostly segregated white. So their motivations are to preserve property values and, to keep it kind of pristine almost. So like, if you think about height, lot width to homeowners is height as to developers. So the more lot width you have as a homeowner, the better. And so in areas west of the park, there are lot widths of 70 feet. That's mandatory. If a developer is going to build, there's a BZA case in there right now where they're trying to build some I think like 10 new homes over there. It's like a subdivision, and each of the lots is 70 feet wide, but the statute requires that it be 70 feet wide from the front lot line to the back lot line. But these lots are oblong shaped. So they're oblong. They're not completely parallel to each other. And so there's some points of the lot that are like 68 feet wide, some points that are 72. And so the residents over there are, fighting that development. I'm not going to speak on whether or not, it's something to fight about. I don't care if they allow, a slightly smaller mansion in some areas. Like, I don't care about that. But that's just to say that not all single family neighborhoods are created equal. So, that's a single family neighborhood. I live in a single family neighborhood in Anacostia. Our lots are only 18 feet wide. So, 70 feet wide, 18 feet wide, not really equal. I think that it is good policy to focus on the wealthier neighborhoods to build more housing because it disrupts things. I don't think that the housing markets that we have are predicated, like if you were just to look at DC as a whole, on supply and demand. I just don't. I think that the markets are manipulated. Like west of the park, you have areas, that are meant to stay pristine, 70 feet apart. In the middle of the city, the motivation is for developers or commercial landowners to be able to build as much as they possibly can. And, just pack as many people in as small a space as possible. Now, the problem with that is, you attract all of these people who make a decent amount of money and, you increase your tax base, but it's not sustainable. People don't want to live in an apartment 2 levels beneath the ground without a window. And this is something that's being proposed over at the Masonic Temple, and their motivations, that's the motivation behind, loosening the comp plan, is to allow these kinds of developments to happen and to occur in the middle of the city. And so I think there probably is some supply and demand elements, but west of the park, not really. And even east of the river, not really. There are different factors that play. And so I would say that it's important to build west of the park, because you start to disrupt that system some. You don't have to pack as many people in the middle of the city if you have 80 AMI housing being built west of the park. Can you build it east of the river? Sure, but you're going to end up displacing people. You're going to end up pushing people out of their neighborhoods. So I think it's important that west of the park start sustaining some of this housing.
From Ambrose Lane, could you define what equitable development should be through the comprehensive plan? And then the second question, can TIF structures be built to hold down or level surrounding property tax rates?
TIFs can, to an extent. I mean, you can extend the TIF further out. So like in Anacostia, the TIF area is just the Reunion Square development. It doesn't extend to the single family homes across Martin Luther King. So I think that you can do that, but at some point, no, you can't, because you just kind of further pushed out the area that's going to take the burden. You see, like some areas going to take the burden. It's almost six in one hand, half dozen in another. I think that's tough. In terms of the other question with, equity in the comp plan, I think it goes back to what Andrea Rosen said, that this is a non-binding document. So it's hard to build equity into a non-binding document. I think the strongest way to build equity would have been for there to be some statutory provisions in the zoning regulations and in the zone laws, DC code. But right now it's just kind of optional whether or not they include equity. Can't hear you, William.
All right. Next question is, what kind of organizing tactics do you believe could be most effective in blocking development that is harmful to local communities?
Well, what kind of organizing tactics? Well, I think the courts are a good path to stall. In terms of stopping, the courts can do that as well, because if something gets stalled long enough, and conditions change, it could end up being stopped. I think that that's just one facet, but I think that definitely opposing these things at the zoning commission is important. I in terms of like this focus of building housing west of the park, I think that is so essential. And I would like to see people east of the river and in the middle of the city start filing for party status in support of affordable projects west of the park if they ever get posed. I know that the council has actually gutted Mayor Bowser's proposal. So McDuffie was like, hey, we want to build this 80 AMI housing all over the city. Well, I mean, that's status quo. You're not doing anything different now. If you're offering the tax abatement everywhere, then they're just going to continue doing what they're doing. There's no incentive to do it west of the park. And so I think that that's key. I think that we should go down to council and like advocate for that. I think that until they start building density and affordable housing west of the park, we're going to keep running into these problems in the middle of the city and east of the river. That's my belief.
Someone asked, this is a question, something I mentioned earlier. What is an LDA? So an LDA is a land disposition agreement, and it's generally between the city and a developer when the city sells land to a developer. And generally the city sells land to a developer at $10, no matter how big it is. Or lately they've done leases like at the wharf, where the whole wharf was leased for $1 a year for 99 years. Similarly at Bruce Monroe, the asking price was $1 a year for 99 years to the developer.
Okay, and I want to answer the question about Nadeau. I think that her move is very misguided. And I'm not saying that just as somebody who lives east of the river in a single family neighborhood, but I can tell you if the focus is just to ban single family neighborhoods, that east of the river is going to catch the brunt of this. There's going to be a lot of displacement. And like I said, not every single family neighborhood is created equal. If you have 70-foot wide lots, it's not the same as an 18-foot wide lot. Just like a 10-story building is not the same as a 2-story building. So some of this stuff is more damaging to affordability and equity and availability of housing than other things. And so I don't think that just a broad brush stroke of destroying single family housing in all of the district is the way to go here.
Okay. I have a question, I guess it was to me, was to ask about where does the investor money come from? And so, as I showed in one slide, most of the investor money so different money goes towards different projects. It's just like everything else. So if you were building a small single family home, your investor money comes from you. You make the down payment, you go get a mortgage from your local bank or Fannie Mae or FHA, and that's how you finance your project. Now, when a project is a $100 million project, there's only so many places that can invest in a $100 million project. And so that's where you get your private equity money goes into a project. Now, the money always comes from other places. So for instance, JBG, which is now JBG Smith, but the original JBG got most of its money and its funds from college endowments, right? So college endowments collect money and they have to grow those endowments. And so they know someone at JBG. JBG got that money, and then it invests in local projects in a community. Similarly, as I said before, Vanguard that has 401ks and other companies that have 401ks collect money and then they have to grow that money. And so some of that money is invested in real estate projects, and those real estate projects have to be a certain size. So a pension fund or Vanguard can't invest directly into your home. It has to invest in a pool of money or in a project that's large enough. So most of that money, of course, comes from teachers, if people saving for their retirement. So that's the cycle. And then that money goes down to developers or other mediators who then aggregate that money and get it to developers. And then that money is used to pay the lobbyists that go to the city council so that the city co-invests in their project. So the safest project to invest in is to invest in a project that they know they're going to get guaranteed a return because the city is involved in the project, because the city is not going to allow that project to fail. And so that's a safe bet. So so what the city does basically determines what kind of money gets invested in your neighborhood, and what kind of money gets invested or wants to get invested determines what kind of projects gets invested in your neighborhood. So, and how do you find out where that money is coming from? Basically, you could just use Google. You find the project, you Google and find who owns the project, and then you find that person, and usually you Google them and they say who invests in their projects. In fact, they usually brag about it. So people will say, I get my money from X pension fund. So that's how you track that money. There's another question from Sharice Muhammad. Has there been an assessment of the grassroots planning coalition's advancement of case litigation in the Court of Appeals and its impact on the quest to curb gentrification? Give us your thoughts. So I guess we'll ask about your gentrification case. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, the gentrification case. Well, we're still working on it. We're at the motion to dismiss phase. Still after almost two years, over 2 years. So yeah, we're just working hard on it.
Can you explain to those who don't know about it what was the case?
Basically, we've significantly narrowed the counts to just 4 counts. And so the first count, I think, is that whenever they do party status, that if it's in a Black neighborhood and it's brought by Black residents, that they have a much more difficult time of getting party status. So when you look at west of the park, there were 15 zoning PUDs cases where party status was at issue between 2013 and 2020. And only one of them was denied party status. And when you look at east of the river and wards 5 and 6, they were like 63. And 40% of them failed on party status. And even a lot of the times when they got party status, they were like really reamed on it. And so one of our clients, of course, was Berry Farm. And Berry Farm notoriously was denied party status. Even though they lived there, they were told that they weren't uniquely impacted enough by the project. And so what we argue is that was racial discrimination. It was violation of the Equal Protection Act. And like, here's the data, and here's our party that experienced this. And so the other one that we raised was this issue of agency reports. Now, agency reports, typically, there's a statute, there's like a single statute, and in the same sentence, it says that, if it's in a historic district, you shall collect documents, you shall collect written reports from the Historic Preservation Office. And it also says you shall collect reports from the Department of Housing and Community Development. Now, the courts recently ruled that the city doesn't have to provide reports unless you ask for them and you tell them the reason why you want them. Now, I know that whenever a PUD is proposed in a historic district, and 37 out of 38 of them are majority white, there's only one majority black one, which is historic Anacostia. So whenever it's in a historic district, we search through the case records. They always provide it. You don't have to ask. They just give it. But they never give DHCD reports, even when you ask. And so at Poplar Point, we have a client that asked for one and said, hey, we want this because we think this is going to resegregate our community. So have Department of Housing and Community Development study this project's impact, this potential 700 unit market rate project impact. I think it's 370 units in the first phase. Let's figure this out before you do it. And they just ignored us and didn't give us the report. And so we're saying that this is a pattern and this is discrimination. And so the other thing is that the creative class agenda, which was to specifically target light industrial zones like Union Market and Buzzard Point with PUD development, had a disparate impact on Black residents. And so this is very clear when you look at them like actually building housing there for the groups of people that they were trying to attract. And when you look and you see that it lost 15% of its Black population and the white population gained 130%, that this has had a disparate impact based on race. And then the fourth count is that all of this stuff, all of these, the way that you acted at the zoning commission and the way that you acted in promulgating this creative action agenda has perpetuated segregation in the city, has kept a segregated enclave in the white area west of the park, kept a segregated neighborhood east of the river, and then in the middle of the city, you switched Black pluralities to white pluralities, perpetuating segregation. That's the lawsuit.
And so from that lawsuit, what would be your desired outcome? What would you expect?
Okay, well, it's class action. And so people who are impacted by, we haven't yet defined the class because it hasn't made it past a motion to dismiss. So, it's still open for definition. And, I'd like to hear feedback from people about how they've been influenced by development, but we'd like class action, a settlement. We'd like a people's council at the zoning commission because there's an imbalance of power between the money developers and a lot of residents and even some of the ANCs. So we'd like a people's council made available there who just solely represents residents, independent people's council. And yeah, we've asked for like written reports and, for the zoning commission to be monitored pretty much.
There's a question that I think would be interesting. So this is from Ambrose Lamb. I'm gonna rephrase this question a little bit. So he's asking about, in essence, are there good developers? And what's the difference between a good developer and a bad developer? Or how do we do this? Is it a developer that's evil? I mean, what's going on in this? And how do we think about it? Is it just we're misusing a tool, or are they just bad people because they're developers?
I think that there are some good developers, and I know one, Warren Williams. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Warren Williams, but he's done some of the developments over there with public housing out in Ward 7. Now, if I'm misspeaking, if there are people in Ward 7 that have an issue with Warren Williams, please let me know. I don't know, like I don't live in Ward 7 and I hate speaking on stuff that's happening in other neighborhoods and I'm not really that familiar. But like I've had several conversations with him and talked to him and he seems like a decent guy. And he told me, he said, hey, none of my projects have ever been appealed. And he said, you know why? It's because I listen to people. People came in, I laid out the specs for what was going to be available in the unit. units, and I heard this feedback from the residents, and I gave it to them. You know, they wanted bigger refrigerators. We gave them bigger refrigerators. It's worth it, you know, like, you know, you just pay a little extra money now so you don't get it in the back end. And I noticed that a lot of times with developers, you know, a lot of them have big egos because they're builders. You know, they have a God complex almost. And so sometimes it's just that they don't want their vision interfered with. And, you know, so like I remember, and I'll give it a specific example of Red Brick, who's like actually a friend now. But I remember when we first appealed their project back in like 2017, 2016, you know, we fought it. It was really messy. It was like a horrible zoning rulings and stuff. And they were like, we're not, you know, they told the ANC, tell Teresa he's not getting from us. He's not, we're not settling anything. And, you know, we went, it was a really messy case. You know, the zoning commission did a horrible job. They actually, like, it was so bad, they withdrew the case while it was being appealed and tried to do it as a map, as a rulemaking map amendment, which was just more mess. And so we ended up getting a very large settlement. And then the ANC was able to negotiate like 2-something million. In the beginning, all we were asking for was like a third of what we ended up getting. So, but like, again, you know, we're still losing. Like, this isn't fun, you know. It's all right when you see like some equity happening, but like, you know, you look at a project that's worth $300 million and the community gets 3 or 4 million. Granted, they were only offering 200,000 in the beginning. You know, like, you're still losing. And again, like, I just don't think that I don't think that the court is where you stop these projects. I think it's done politically. I think it's done through policy with teeth, through statutes, actual statutes, not like non-binding comp plan provisions. But yeah, I think that's where it's at. And I think that there are some developers who are better than other developers. After that experience, Red Brick like comes to like meetings in the community. They're like really involved with stuff. They've bought in now. So they're more involved and they're more eager to hear what we have to say. But yeah, I think that there are some decent developers, but I think that probably 8 or 9 out of 10 of them don't want to listen to the community, don't want to listen to residents, would rather save money up front and not think about how it may cost them later on. Yeah, I think there are some good ones, but not many.
So I want to ask you a question based on, you know, kind of my pet peeve, which is when I help pay people to kick my butt. So it's really the city's public-private partnerships.
Exactly.
Where
yeah.
the city is aligned with a developer, and then that developer proposes a project that basically blows the comp plan away, and then encourages the developer not to negotiate with the community at all. So we're paying for it with public dollars. In many of these larger projects, even the ones that Union Market or over there at the Navy Yard, most of those projects have been backed by public dollars. I mean, for the most part, many of these larger projects that blow up the comp plan would not come were it not for the city's investment in those projects. So you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that that's that's horrible, and you know, it happens all over the city, where the city is financing these projects, and not only do they finance them with money, but you know, being able to like expedite these hearings and not listen to any resident concerns. That's another form of subsidy, right? Because you know, normally this stuff would be more costly for them. I I just think that yeah, it's a challenge, and that's why I say that like the most effective ways to organize always, you know, they may involve the courts, but always the bottom line is politics and organization and being able to reach these developers, not developers, but politicians who are making these decisions, and going that route.
There's a question here from Rodney Jordan. How do non-DC residents help with your equity and justice efforts here in DC? And how do residents in localities outside of DC without the DC government structure learn from your efforts to support responsible, equitable development, opportunity-based housing wherever they live?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the first step is, you know, all politics are local. So just staying up with like your own area and hey Ronnie, and I think that you do that, and I think that that's great, and you know, it's a mutual exchange. You know, like when I talk to people from Norfolk like yourself, or people who are in other areas, like I learn things. I learn about what's happening there, and it informs a lot of the strategy that happens here. And so I think probably the main thing is just staying on top of what's happening locally, and then making time and space to speak with people in different parts of the country about what they're experiencing. And I think that's like super valuable.
There's a question here from Anonymous. Why do you think the city invests in public-private partnerships? Do city council members and other government officials personally have anything to gain from them? So what's happening here?
Could you explain you know, the bonds and the growth rate and all that stuff? I think that's a good segue.
Okay. Yeah, so part of it, I think maybe I'll share. I like to make block diagrams, so I don't know how useful they are, but you know, I used to work with someone, and they always said, if you want to understand something, find out how the money works. And then once you figure out how the money works, then maybe you can get to some other things. So when one of the things that I think Washington, D.C. brags about a lot is their AAA bond rating, right? So this is something we prize, and I remember attending an event with the CFO who basically said, once you get a AAA, you can't lose it. So our AAA bond rating is what this, I think, is the main motivating factor, you know, from a public policy standpoint, you know, keeping the AAA bond rating. And your AAA bond rating, when to get that, they rate your city as a business. So think of the city as a business. And this is your credit score, is your bond rating for your business. So the city of Washington, D.C. is growth. So the city has told in its business plan to the bond rating people, we're going to grow by X number population. And in order to grow by X number of population, we need to build X amount of housing. And so to keep your bond rating, they come back and check every year. Are you growing? Are you growing? Are you growing? And it's not just growth, it's that we told them we're going to grow by bringing in high income earners. When they say high income earners, they don't mean market rate, they mean above the current market rate. So in our bond documents, we've basically told the bond rating agency, we're going to bring in people who make $150,000 or more into the city, and we're going to bring them in at a certain rate. And that's sort of the underlying, in order to keep our AAA bond rating, they're going to come and count. Are you meeting this level of growth? And that's what they're looking for. Now, in order to meet that level of growth, the city is borrowing a lot of money so that people will build the housing for the people who they need for the growth. And they have to build a housing that's going to attract people who make 150,000 or more, and they have to do a lot of it. So, I don't know if that explains it, but that is sort of one of the political motivating factors. That's why when you talk to council members, the first thing they talk about, we have to grow. So when the mayor says we need 36,000 new units, that's because that's what they told the bond ratings, and that's the money that has to come, and they borrowed the money in order to make that happen. And so neighborhoods don't really count anymore, except, as you mentioned, those neighborhoods that already have incomes of 150,000 or more, right? And if your housing doesn't, that's okay, as long as you can, the group housing, or now what they call co-living, where you can take several people that make 80,000 and let them live in the same house, as long as that adds up to over 150,000. So we're kind of caught in this cycle where, you have to do that. And so that's where I've always tried to study, the money, what's driving it. And if we don't understand how that money flows into a deal. So that's what I did here with the wharf. I tried to go back and figure out where all the money coming in to the wharf was, especially in phase one. So phase one was a $1.2 billion project, but the city put in $300 million, basically made the down payment on the project. So the developer doesn't have any responsibility because it's basically a gift from that point on. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that that's the driving force now in the city. They just have to grow in order to we know it's unsustainable, but for now, we just have to keep growing for it to be sustainable or appear sustainable. Let's see. There's a question here. Is there a city or county or state that is doing a much more equitable job with development than DC?
Yes. Montgomery County is a good place to look. So they actually have like equity, like they have metrics that they use to measure like how a proposed development will impact the surrounding area. So like there's a lot of math and like social science and all that stuff. So they have metrics and rubrics that they go by. And even Virginia has like a Fairfax County, I think Fairfax County, Arlington County, one of those, they've done a lot better job of like incorporating like pretty wealthy homes around public housing. So like, areas very nearby have done a better job. Even in California, I remember talking to some people out there. The way that their stuff works is that they have 20% affordable housing for every project that's built. Like it has to be 20% affordable in San Francisco. So yeah, there are areas that are doing a better job than DC. And I would say that DC actually is going the complete opposite direction compared to most areas that I'm aware of, who are like at least trying to incorporate real equity provisions and not just equity provisions and non-binding documents.
So going along that line, and I'll use the word clumsily, in our power structure here in Washington, D.C., political and otherwise, are there any allies of what we would call just and equitable development, or people who are close enough, or is this pure politics? If we organize enough and put enough pressure, then that person becomes the kind of person we want them to be. And is that really the environment that we're in? Is really just boots on the ground, pressing our political representatives to do the right thing?
No, I really don't know the answer, but I can say that Trayon White is, probably the only council person that I would like vouch for and say is actually putting his money where his mouth is when he talks about equitable development and including existing businesses and including, existing residents. I don't know, maybe Alyssa Silverman. I don't know. I'm not sure. I can't really put my name on that, but I would do that for Trayon White. I don't think that there are any politicians that are the friends of people who live in the middle of the city, who want affordable housing, who want comfortable housing, who wants the kind of housing that they can grow into and have a family. I don't think that there's any politician that's your friend. If you live east of the river, I think just Trayon White. If you live west of the park, I think everybody's your friend. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to talk bad about people from west of the parks. I know a lot of them are, they're grassroots planning coalition members. I've spoke with them. They're conscientious. And a lot of us, we just want our communities to reflect what we want, we want our communities to be a reflection of our values and our culture and, how we live and how we're used to living. And we don't want people coming from outside and telling us how to do things. And so I know that a lot of times, sometimes even west of the park, when the developer comes in, sometimes stuff happens that's not fair at the zoning commission. I've seen it in different projects that have been proposed over there, where the zoning commission is kind of, not, I mean, it's not as blatant as in some other places, but I mean, yeah. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's community centric anywhere. I think the overriding factors is what, Jordan's talking about with this bond rating and attracting people. And I think that's pretty much the driving force of everything that's happening here.
So going back or using Berry Farm or some of the other examples, some of us have been suggesting that the city should, if it's going to invest in development, that equity should go first to resident-led organizations that then invest in those projects versus straight to the developer or straight to whatever the entity is going to be. So do you have any thoughts on how any structures could be used to empower, whether it's particularly in this case, I think we all know that the big hot spot now is public housing, is that the largest block land that's attackable with, that doesn't have the political strength is probably those who live in public housing. And it's my intention that that's where the vultures are going to head. But I'd like to hear from you if you know of any processes or structures or anything that you would recommend in that coming battle.
I mean, that's so tough. I know, from my research, that public housing is essential to not resegregating communities. Everywhere where there's public housing and development, it actually can be a fairly integrated community. I mean, granted, you would like to see the people in public housing become economically integrated as well, and that should be a goal. But at least on the surface, wherever there's public housing, there's a potential for an integrated kind of community. I don't know what the answer is. There just doesn't appear to be the political will. There was a vote to remove $50 million in funding from the streetcar to put into public housing, and it lost 5 to 8. So I mean, you know, I don't know the answers, but you know, there just doesn't appear to be the political will for it right now. You know, I mean, if at a time of like, you know, this great protest, great unrest, you know, all kinds of hardship, they can't take money from the streetcar and put it into people's homes. Like, I mean, that says like volumes to me. Like, when will that happen if you can't do it now? So, yeah, I don't know.
There's another question, I guess back to the PUD world, and someone asked me to define PUD, plan unit development. So if you can kind of say what that means as you answer this question. So how does IZ inclusionary zoning set the bar for PUD affordability benefits? Is it equitable? And if not, why and how do we make the PUD affordability equitable, AKA the number of units and the size of units? Because, you know, in this city, they count an efficiency in a 3-bedroom unit as though it's the same. And of course, for people, it's not the same.
Right. Yeah. I think that it's not equitable at all. You know, because you see all of those PUDs in Union Market, where you see the population went from, you know, grew 130% white, lost 15% black. All of those had IZ included in them, right? But a lot of times, none of the IZ was family housing. Like Jordan said, a lot of it wasn't family housing. A lot of the PUDs, you know, the affordability was set at like 60 AMI or 80 AMI, which, you know, may have been out of the range of people in that community before the PUDs got built. And how can we make them more equitable? Build them west of the park. I think that 80 AMI building would be beautiful west of the park. You know, I would hope that people living west of the park wouldn't be concerned about being overrun by poor people, because even 80 AMI is a lot of money. So, I mean, and I don't think it's going to displace people over there. It may change a little bit about, you know, the character of the neighborhood and that sort of thing. But I think that it takes some pressure off of the middle areas of the city, and it would take some pressures off of east of the river. Because a lot of times what happens is a lot of the development that happens east of the river is infill development. And so they'll build like really big McMansions over here as an incentive for people who are trying to grow, who live in the middle of the city. People want to grow a family. You know, they'll sell a really, you know, comparatively, like you could buy like a McMansion in Deanwood for like 500,000, 600,000, which is very affordable to some people in DC. It's completely unaffordable to the people in these neighborhoods. But like, that's where people in the middle of the city go who want to stay in DC. They lure them with these big McMansions that shouldn't have been built in the first place, that violate all kinds of zoning regulations, all kinds of BZA regulations, and that would never happen anywhere else. They lure them to our neighborhoods with that kind of development. But I think that if they were to build 80 AMI, you know, homes west of the park, or 60 AMI, people wouldn't be so tempted to move into those kinds of properties over here and displace people and like upset things. So, I mean, I really think the solution is just to start building more. Like I said, for the entire west of the park between 2010 and 2018, they only had 8 PUDs. So, you know, and then you got 2 census tracts in Union Market that got 20. And that's just not, you know, I mean, anybody can look at that and see that that's not fair.
There's a question here mainly directed at you. So what types of cases are you hoping to take on in the future? And what type of potential clients should reach out to you?
Well, any clients, you know, that's had some kind of issue I like representing the small guy. I don't not like I wouldn't want to represent like red brick or anything like that. But if you're a small developer, I'll represent you. If you're community minded, you know, just community minded people. That's my practice. Like I have a community practice. I represented charter schools, church, and that's another thing that a lot of people don't think about with land use. Churches have a lot of power because of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which is a federal statute which has teeth, and so they have power. So like if you could ever get a church involved in whatever group you're organizing, that could help, you know, help you in your leverage against the developer or the city. But yeah, like just community-minded residents. That's who I like to represent.
Someone wants you to find where's the middle of the city. Can you kind of put some?
So I would say
the
green line spine. So, you know, the green line runs from like, I guess, Fort Totten all the way down to like, you know, waterfront. And so that kind of area over there. And then like it radiates over some, right? So it's the Religious Land Use Institutionalized Persons Act. But yeah, it goes over some, radiates out some, out to H Street, out to Union Market, but just kind of that like middle area from like west of the park, east of Rock Creek, over to, you know, I'd say the Anacostia. Like all of that's a battleground. That's the area sustaining all of the development and all of the displacement right now.
Mm-hmm. So there's a question. Oh, so the mayor's 36,000 new homes order. So what do you think? Do you have an idea of what do you think the pandemic and density, is they going to have any impact? Are people going to think different about density now that the pandemic has hit?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I think that you know, we may see some changes just because the bond markets change and like, you know, they realize this isn't sustainable. And so it's no longer, you know, going to be a thing to be like, oh, we're going to have 900,000 people by such and such. Hey, this stuff is a joke. It's a joke. When I looked at their projections, I like drew it. I continued because like they had a chart in there and it there was a second industrial revolution between the 1950s and the mid 1970s, right? And that's when like there were like huge population booms. People were making all kinds of money. There was like a very small gap between people who made little and people who made a lot. And it was just halcyon times. It was like great. And so their projection for now was like the same as the second industrial revolution, but it had none of the same conditions. You know, that inequality is worse as it's ever been. So, I mean, I think that that stuff is just a joke. It's not real. There's not going to be 900,000 people living here. And, you know, if anything, you know, the virus and COVID has kind of like, you know, revealed that, you know, the emperor has no clothes. And like this stuff just is not going to happen.
Yeah, because we know when we were working on the framework of the comp plan is that the population numbers are purely made up almost. So it turned out that, you know, we would ask the city, where'd you get your number from? They said they got it from COG. So we went to ask COG, where'd you get the number from? Oh, we got it from the city, right? And then the city changed the formula so that it could justify it. So it went to the Census Bureau and changed how they calculate the estimates. So it used to be you calculate it based on kind of counting people and then extrapolating from that. They changed it to weigh it more heavily on the number of housing units on paper in the pipeline. So then the city began to invest in, borrow money from the bond market so they could invest in developers. Developers then would put on paper, we're going to go get a PUD and build X number of units, and then the population would count those units as full, which would then justify the next PUD, and then the cycle will continue. So I knew from my neighborhood that it was a scam because after the 2008 recession, most of those apartment buildings had been emptied in condo conversions. But if you check the record, they said the population was growing. But then it couldn't have been growing because I knew all those buildings were empty. But they changed the way they calculate, population. So yes, you're correct. It's a scam. And as long as the bond market buys it, it's an acceptable scam.
And let me add something to this. I had an experience in Union Market where I was approached by somebody who does an EB5 program. I don't think I'm saying this right, but it's basically where they get foreign investors to develop, right? And so what she was telling me is she steps in when they can't get the financing from the bank. So full stop. If a developer can't get financing from a bank to do what they're doing, get all the financing they need to build, that means that it's probably not a good thing, right? And so what they do to get this financing, right, to fill the gaps, because the bank is only willing to give so much, they get this foreign EB5 visa person to where people with a lot of money from other countries will agree to invest in the development project. That's a bad move because none of the banks want to do it in order to get their citizenship, right? So what you're seeing here is there's developments being built that people who live here and who have no idea, have no desire to build them and no desire to invest in it. But there are people who have incentives that have nothing to do with our housing, nothing to do with our markets, to invest in this anyway, just so they can get citizenship. Okay. And all they have to say is they're going to produce a certain amount of jobs. And it's all on paper. It's all on paper. So the whole thing is like a scam.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's exactly, again, when I showed the numbers earlier, one of the top investors is Norway. So one of the top investors in JBG and all of the projects that are running in DC is in Norway. Canada, Brookfield that just basically bought the Navy Yard from, I forgot the name of the developer that was there before, but they basically own most of the Navy Yard. That's Canada, right? That's pension fund and mineral money coming out of Canada that knows it can make good money in DC real estate because we won't enforce the comp plan. And so they know they can build whatever they want to build. And the city is going to make sure they don't lose money with TIFs, tax abatements, and displacement, whatever displacement they need to do to make the deals work. So it's a great deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's see. Okay, how do we stiffen housing cost speculation in the rent's too damn high phenomena? And I'll piggyback on that. So someone asked earlier, what do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the things we see now is going to have an impact on any of this? Do you expect this to translate into some of the issues that we're talking about here today?
Could you repeat that?
Related to the Black Lives Matter movement, that the protests and some of the things that we're seeing today, will that translate into the activism that we need in communities to deal with this housing and other issues?
I honestly don't think so. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is, yeah, I just don't think so. I mean, they're very focused on their issue that they have, which is police brutality. I know they've spoken some about, you know, cancel the rent and all that stuff, but no, and I mean, you could think about this. Like a lot of the liberals and stuff, you know, and I'm gonna be frank here. A lot of the white liberals who invest and donate to stuff like Black Lives Matter, you know, there are some really conscientious people. I'm not just gonna generalize here. Some very conscientious people, but like for people who kind of middle ground, who are like, you know, living through this period of like intense unrest and they want to do something, I think the obvious thing is to be like, okay, well, I'm gonna donate to Black Lives Matter. But that doesn't mean that, you know, just because they're against a police officer standing on the neck of somebody for like 10 minutes straight, and they're willing to give money to that, doesn't mean that they're gonna give money so like our housing system can be more equitable, or so they could build something next to their house that they don't necessarily want. So I don't think that the two necessarily translate, because, you know, I think when you're talking about police brutality, you know, that's like bare minimum, like the lowest lying fruit. Like, you know, there are people who are willing to donate and give and spend energy so the state doesn't randomly kill me.
Right.
But there's a difference between that and like the state providing like equitable communities, or like, you know, family-friendly communities. Like, it's very different. So,
So
yeah.
what I'm gonna do, I just got a text saying I'm over time and I always mess up. So I'm gonna ask you to give us some closing remarks. And then we're gonna wrap up and hopefully we can get you back again.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank everybody for staying on the call. It's been, you know, almost 2 hours. And, you know, thank you for staying on this long. And if you have any questions, you know, you could contact me. You could find me on Facebook. You know, I'll accept a friend request, or you could, you know, my name of my law firm is Stoop Law, and you could email me any questions that you have that weren't answered. So Stoop Law, STOOPLAW, like, you know, your stoop out front of your house. And yeah, and so that's a good segue to tell you about my practice. Like if I can't hear about it from my stoop, you know, from the people coming, and like that's like my practice. So, okay.
Yeah. All right, well, we're gonna wrap up. I thank everybody for taking the time to deal with us rambling on, and, you know, hopefully we can do this again, and hopefully we learn something out of this process. So thank you again, Ari, and thank you again, DC Grassroots Planning Coalition, and we'll speak to you soon.
All right, bye.
All right, bye.
Thanks, Jordan.